Truth is never silent. It rises first where we least expect it, exposing the emptiness we try so carefully to decorate. Modern life, with its abundance of choices and its poverty of self-understanding, has only sharpened this fracture at the center of the human psyche. What we call confusion is often the unnamed shadow inside us, moving long before we notice its footsteps. And Jung, long before the fevered pace of 2025, had already mapped this inner terrain with an accuracy that feels almost unnerving. He revealed that our suffering is not accidental. It is the echo of something within us that has never been faced. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Yet, the essential question remains, sharp and unavoidable. What operates inside us when we believe we are fully in control? Jung insisted that the unconscious is not a passive archive. It is a living system, shaping our choices, our fears, our repetitions. To look away from it is to surrender our lives to forces we pretend not to recognize. And this is where the real descent begins. Because to understand why we repeat our wounds, why we collapse under invisible pressures, or why certain desires pull us with inexplicable force, we must step beneath the thin layer of consciousness we mistake for the whole self. From here, the path opens into the body of the work. 10 chapters that strip away illusion, confront the hidden architecture of the mind, and guide us toward the deeper landscape the outline has prepared. Consciousness is never the single clear surface we like to imagine. It is a layered field, a landscape built on tension between what we know and what silently operates beneath us. The modern person believes they are self-aware because they can describe their preferences, their habits, their wounds. But this is only the upper floor of a house whose foundation remains invisible. Jung revealed that the human psyche is not unified, but two-tiered, and that almost everything truly decisive happens in the level we do not see. This division is not metaphor. It is the architecture of our inner life. And the tragedy is simple. We mistake the visible tip of our being for the whole self. And then we suffer because we cannot understand why our choices betray us, why our emotions overwhelm us, why our desires seem foreign and uncontrollable. Consciousness is small. The unconscious is vast. And most of us live as if this imbalance did not define us. Before modern psychology cleaned its vocabulary and softened its claims, Jung dared to assert the unsettling truth. The unconscious is not a storage room of forgotten memories, but a living system with its own intelligence, motivation, and will. It moves beneath the surface of awareness, like an undercurrent beneath a calm sea. It remembers what we refuse to recall. It desires what we pretend not to want. It warns us in dreams, interrupts us with impulses, sabotages us with fear, and pulls us toward situations we swear we do not choose. To understand ourselves at all, we must accept that we are not solely the authors of our inner life. We are also the battleground where deeper forces play out their ancient dramas. This is where the fracture of the modern soul becomes visible. The person of today, surrounded by choices yet devoid of inner clarity, believes they suffer because the world is chaotic. But the chaos lies within. We try to fix our external life while refusing to look at the internal architecture shaping every decision. We chase new jobs, new relationships, new habits, hoping the next version of ourselves will finally feel coherent. But coherence cannot come from rearranging the visible layer. It comes from facing the hidden one. The unconscious does not disappear simply because the conscious self ignores it. It grows stronger in silence. Jung insisted that the unconscious acts whenever consciousness is absent, and consciousness is absent far more often than we admit. This leads to the first unavoidable truth. We do not know ourselves. We know our masks. We know our roles. We know the stories we tell to make sense of our past. But beneath these narratives lie impulses shaped by forgotten experiences, unresolved emotions, myths we inherited without knowing it, and patterns formed long before we had language to describe them. The misunderstanding that self-awareness is a matter of introspection dissolves quickly under Jung's gaze. Introspection examines only what consciousness already knows. The unconscious requires a descent. It requires humility. It requires the courage to confront what does not fit our ideal image of who we think we are. Most people avoid these descents, not because they are weak, but because they sense the cost of knowing too much about themselves. Yet, the unconscious does not remain distant. It acts in our relationships. It shapes our conflicts. It repeats our childhood wounds through adult decisions. We call this fate. Jung called it unfinished inner life seeking completion. The present is never only the present. It is built on layers of history stored in the psyche. Many of our strongest reactions do not belong to the situations we attach them to. They belong to earlier versions of ourselves, still living within us, still demanding recognition. The past does not pass. It becomes architecture. And every time we are startled by our own behavior, every time we say, I do not know why I did that, the unconscious reveals its power. To understand this two-tiered mind is to recognize that the unconscious is not an enemy, but a neglected partner. It holds the material that consciousness cannot handle, yet still needs to grow. Jung believed that the unconscious compensates for the attitudes of the conscious mind. If we become too rigid, it introduces chaos. If we become too emotional, it introduces restraint. If we become too arrogant, it introduces doubt. Its function is balance, not sabotage. But when we deny or suppress its messages, it intensifies them. Anxiety becomes chronic. Patterns repeat with brutal precision. Desire becomes compulsion. The unconscious escalates until consciousness finally listens. In the modern era of 2025, this internal imbalance becomes even more violent. The conscious mind is overstimulated by information, choices, noise. It grows louder but not deeper. It mistakes activity for awareness. The unconscious, meanwhile, becomes more agitated because the person rarely enters silence, rarely reflects without distraction, rarely examines their interior life without the mediation of a screen or a curated image. The result is spiritual disorientation. People feel lost without understanding why. They experience emotional storms without understanding their origin. They interpret symptoms as identity rather than messages from a deeper layer. Jung's insight becomes painfully relevant. When consciousness loses contact with the unconscious, neurosis becomes inevitable. Psychologically, the two-tier structure explains why change feels impossible. Conscious decisions lack power because they attempt to override forces rooted below awareness. You can decide to stop a habit, but if the unconscious clings to the emotional meaning of that habit, the habit will return. You can choose a relationship logically, but if the unconscious carries unresolved wounds, it will sabotage the intimacy you try to build. Willpower breaks against the walls of what the unconscious has not yet released. This is why people repeat mistakes with precision. They are not irrational. They are being guided by a deeper script written long before they consciously understood themselves. This script reveals another truth Jung emphasized. We are born into a psychic inheritance. The unconscious contains not only personal history, but collective layers, archetypes, instincts, patterns shaped by centuries of human experience. These ancient layers influence our behavior subtly but powerfully. When we respond with disproportionate fear, sudden intuition, inexplicable attraction, or symbolic dreams, we are touching the deeper strata of the psyche. Consciousness rides atop this ocean, but the currents below determine its direction. Jung's division between consciousness and unconsciousness is therefore not an academic distinction. It is the starting point of all self-understanding. To ignore the unconscious is to live as a stranger to oneself. To acknowledge it is to begin the slow and often painful journey toward wholeness. This wholeness does not come from in suffering that feels both mysterious and inevitable. The journey downward continues not through explanation, but through confrontation with the forces that shape us from the inside. And those forces begin with the restless current of psychic energy that animates every thought, every desire, and every contradiction within the human soul. Energy does not move inside us by accident. It pulses according to a law older than our desires, older than our personality, older than consciousness itself. When Jung spoke of libido, he was not speaking of desire in the narrow sense that popular psychology later adopted. He meant life energy, the current that animates thought, emotion, imagination, and instinct. This energy flows in patterns the conscious mind cannot fully command. It seeks expression, form, direction. And when consciousness obstructs it or forces it into rigid channels, the energy does not disappear. It gathers, it coils, it hardens, it becomes symptom. What we call anxiety, exhaustion, obsession, or emotional collapse is often nothing more than the cry of energy that has been denied its natural movement. The modern individual, trapped between hyper-rational discipline and unexamined impulses, lives with this blockage as a permanent condition. We try to manage ourselves as though we were machines that can be calibrated by routines and adjusted by decisions. But the psyche does not obey mechanical logic. When the conscious mind pushes too far in one direction, the unconscious compensates. This principle of compensation is the cornerstone of Jung's understanding of inner life. The psyche seeks equilibrium the way a body seeks balance. If one part becomes extreme, the other part rises to counteract it. The misunderstanding that we are fully in control of our psychological state dissolves under this truth. We steer our lives with one hand, while the deeper currents steer with the other. This compensatory movement explains why the person who prides themselves on being rational becomes overwhelmed by emotions they cannot name. It explains why the strong collapse inward when solitude grows too heavy. It explains why the gentle erupt in sudden anger, and why the controlling find themselves swept away by impulses they thought they had mastered. The unconscious does not tolerate one-sidedness. It pushes back. When the conscious mind refuses to integrate feeling, feeling bursts through in irrational forms. When the conscious mind suppresses vulnerability, vulnerability reappears as anxiety. The psyche demands balance, and it will create it through conflict if harmony is denied. This interplay reveals the deeper structure of human suffering. We suffer not because energy is absent, but because it is trapped. We cling to identities that limit its movement. We cling to beliefs about who we must be, who we cannot be, what we should feel, what we must not feel. These beliefs form walls inside the psyche. Energy hits these walls and rebounds, creating turbulence within us. A person may cling to strength so tightly they cannot admit exhaustion, and so the exhaustion becomes bitterness. Another may cling to logic so tightly they cannot tolerate ambiguity, and so ambiguity becomes terror. Another may cling to independence so fiercely that dependency becomes shame, and so affection turns into suffocation. Energy seeks expression. When expression is denied, it returns with force. In the world of 2025, this internal struggle becomes magnified. Society demands efficiency, clarity, productivity. The conscious mind adapts by becoming more rigid, more focused, more controlling. But the unconscious resists this mechanical discipline. It demands depth, instinct, imagination, rest, surrender. When the world tells us to accelerate, the unconscious tells us to retreat. When the world tells us to optimize, the unconscious tells us to wander. This collision between external expectation and inner need creates a quiet crisis in modern life. People feel drained without understanding why. They label themselves weak when their energy collapses, not realizing that the collapse is the psyche's attempt to protect itself from suffocation. The principle of compensation becomes clearer through emotional extremes. Think of the person who prides themselves on calm. They suppress irritation, swallow frustration, maintain composure long past the breaking point. Eventually, the suppressed energy gathers into a single explosive reaction that feels alien even to them. They say, "I do not recognize myself," but the outburst is not foreign. It is accumulated energy reclaiming its place. Or consider the fiercely independent person who refuses to rely on others. Their conscious mind tells them dependence is failure. So the unconscious compensates by generating longing so intense it becomes obsession or self-sabotage in relationships. The conscious stance pushes in one direction. The unconscious pushes in the other. And the result is emotional war. This war intensifies when one layer refuses to listen. The conscious mind believes it can dominate the psyche through discipline. It tries to silence grief through distraction. It tries to silence fear through logic. It tries to silence desire through moral pressure. But the unconscious has no interest in obedience. It does not negotiate. It compensates. The more aggressively consciousness denies an emotion, the stronger the emotion grows in the shadows. And when it finally emerges, it does so not as gentle insight, but as symptom. Panic attacks, compulsive behavior, insomnia, irrational jealousy, creative paralysis, or an unexplainable sense of emptiness. Energy that cannot move becomes pathology. Jung understood this better than any thinker of his era. When libido is blocked, the psyche stagnates. The person feels dull, disconnected, numb. They drift through life mechanically, performing tasks without meaning. This numbness is not absence of emotion, it is energy trapped behind psychological barriers. The tragedy is that many interpret this numbness as a personal flaw rather than a signal. They believe they lack passion, when in truth, passion has been sealed away. They believe they lack intuition, when intuition has been drowned by noise. They believe they lack identity, when identity has been split by internal conflict. The psyche is not malfunctioning. It is trying to survive a one-sided conscious position. Jung insisted that the path to psychological health begins with restoring the natural flow of libido. This requires confronting the rigid beliefs that fence the psyche into narrow channels. The person must ask themselves why they cling to certain traits so fiercely. Why must they always be strong? Why must they never show fear? Why must they always have answers? Why must they never need others? These rigid ideals are the walls that block the movement of energy. They are defenses built long ago, often in childhood, when vulnerability seemed dangerous or unacceptable. But the unconscious does not care about the origins of these defenses. It only cares that they distort balance. And so it compensates relentlessly. That compensation often appears in dreams, the realm where the unconscious communicates without censorship. Dreams reveal the areas where energy has been trapped. They present the forgotten emotions, the hidden fears, the forbidden desires. But most people ignore their dreams because they seem strange or disconnected from waking life. Jung argued that the strangeness is precisely the point. The unconscious speaks in symbols because symbols express complexity that logic cannot handle. When a dream shows a house with a locked room, it is showing part of the psyche that has been sealed away. When a dream presents a river that cannot be crossed, it is showing blocked energy. When a dream presents a fire that burns uncontrollably, it is showing emotion seeking release. The dreams reveal the imbalance long before symptoms appear. In waking life, the signs are no less symbolic. Someone may find themselves inexplicably irritated by a colleague who expresses traits they repress in themselves. Someone may feel overwhelmed by situations that require emotional vulnerability because their internal walls reject it. Someone may experience sudden attraction, not because of romance, but because the other person embodies qualities they have denied within themselves. Energy seeks expression through projection, symptom, relationship, imagination. It refuses silence. This refusal reveals the deep intelligence of the unconscious. It does not retaliate randomly. It compensates with precision. If consciousness leans too heavily on thought, the unconscious pushes emotion. If consciousness clings to morality, the unconscious pushes desire. If consciousness glorifies strength, the unconscious pushes weakness. If consciousness demands control, the unconscious pushes surrender. Each push is a step toward equilibrium. The psyche does not seek perfection, it seeks wholeness. Yet wholeness is frightening. It requires integrating parts of ourselves we have spent years avoiding. It requires acknowledging desires that conflict with our values, emotions that contradict our image, impulses that unsettle our stability. Many resist this integration because it threatens their conscious identity. But identity built on repression is fragile. It collapses under the slightest pressure. Jung believed the purpose of psychic imbalance is to force the ego to expand, to become more inclusive, more flexible, more honest. The ego must learn it is not the sovereign ruler of the psyche, but a negotiator between worlds. This negotiation becomes the defining task of inner life. The conscious mind must learn to listen to the unconscious without surrendering to it. It must learn to regulate without dominating, to guide without suffocating, to integrate without erasing difference. When this negotiation begins, energy flows more freely. Creativity returns. Emotional stability increases. Relationships deepen. Symptoms diminish. The person begins to feel alive again, not because problems disappear, but because the psychic system regains balance. As this balance returns, a new question emerges, one sharper than the last. If energy flows differently through every individual, what determines the pattern of this flow? Why do some people withdraw while others pursue? Why do some rely on thought while others rely on intuition? Why do some perceive the world through sensation while others perceive it through meaning? These differences are not accidents of personality. They arise from the innate channels through which energy naturally moves. And to understand the self more deeply, one must examine these channels, the orientations and functions that shape not only how we experience the world, but how the world experiences you. Personality is never a surface trait. It is the deep structure through which psychic energy flows and forms itself. What most people call personality is merely behavior, the visible residue of invisible patterns. But Jung understood that the psyche organizes itself according to inherent channels, orientations, and functions that shape not only what we do, but how we experience reality itself. These orientations are not preferences. They are internal gravitational fields. They determine where our energy gathers, where it retreats, how it interprets the world, and how it defends itself against psychic imbalance. Without recognizing this structure, we misinterpret ourselves endlessly. We punish ourselves for patterns that are not moral flaws, but natural configurations of the psyche. And we judge others for differences that are not choices, but distinct architectures of inner life. As psychic energy flows through these channels, the first great division emerges. Whether energy moves outward or inward, extroversion and introversion in Jung's world are not social traits, but existential orientations. The extrovert directs their energy toward the outer world, objects, people, action, environment. They metabolize experience externally. They stabilize themselves through engagement. The introvert directs energy inward, toward subjective interpretation, internal states, and private meaning. They metabolize experience internally. They stabilize themselves through retreat. Neither orientation is superior. Both are necessary forms of survival. But when the world demands one orientation at the expense of the other, imbalance grows. The misunderstanding begins when society romanticizes extroversion as vitality and pathologizes introversion as withdrawal. Yet the extrovert often escapes their inner conflicts by dispersing energy outward. They drown their inner contradictions through activity. They rely on the external world for stimulation because silence forces them into confrontation with themselves. Meanwhile, the introvert protects themselves from the chaos of external demands because their inner world is already turbulent enough. They withdraw not out of fear, but out of necessity to manage depth. In the age of 2025, with constant stimulation and social pressure, extroversion becomes a cultural mandate, and introversion becomes misread as dysfunction. This tension forces many into psychic positions that betray their natural orientation. And when orientation is betrayed, energy becomes distorted. The second layer of personality arises from the four functions through which consciousness interprets reality: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. These functions are not skills, but perceptual mechanisms. Thinking evaluates through logic, feeling through value, sensation through the concrete, intuition through possibility. Each person possesses all four, but one becomes dominant, shaping the movement of energy. The dominant function becomes the lens through which reality is organized, and the inferior function becomes the blind spot where the unconscious gathers power. A thinking dominant individual interprets the world through structure, clarity, logic. They seek coherence. They fear ambiguity. They pursue truth through concepts. But this dominance comes at a cost. Feeling, the inferior function, becomes underdeveloped and therefore dangerous. Emotions become unpredictable, overwhelming, foreign. The person who prides themselves on rationality becomes undone by sudden emotional storms. They collapse into sentimentality or coldness because feeling exists in extremes when not consciously integrated. Their logic becomes brittle because it lacks the warmth of value. A feeling-dominant individual interprets the world through emotional resonance, meaning, connection. They seek harmony, they fear coldness. They evaluate the world not by truth, but by significance. But their thinking function becomes inferior, and thus when intellectual demands arise, they may feel inadequate, anxious, or defensive. Their emotions become moral judgments. Their judgments become absolute. They drown in empathy or harden into self-righteousness. Their warmth becomes volatility because reason has no seat in their psychic parliament. A sensation-dominant individual is anchored in the present, in details, in physical reality. They perceive through the body. They trust what they can verify. They fear abstraction. But intuition becomes the inferior function, and so the unknown becomes threatening. Their practicality blinds them to long-term consequences. Their groundedness becomes rigidity. They resist change even when change is necessary. They become trapped in what is because they cannot imagine what could be. An intuition-dominant individual perceives patterns, potential, symbolism, futures. They live in possibilities. They fear confinement. But sensation as the inferior function leaves them unmoored. They struggle with routine, physical grounding, embodiment. They float above life rather than inhabit it. Their creativity becomes chaos. Their vision becomes escapism. Their imagination becomes detachment from reality. Each dominant function creates its own blind spot, and in that blind spot, the unconscious stores emotional weight, unresolved conflict, and unintegrated impulses. This is where personality becomes destiny. Not because traits dictate fate, but because the inferior function quietly shapes behavior from the shadows. Jung believed that the inferior function is the gateway to the unconscious. It is the place where the psyche hides everything the conscious orientation refuses to acknowledge. To understand oneself is to examine this inferior territory. This structure becomes more complex when we recognize that energy seeks balance among these functions. If thinking dominates too intensely, feeling erupts unconsciously. If feeling dominates too intensely, thinking becomes hostile and punitive. If sensation becomes rigid, intuition surges in dreams, fantasies, or impulsive decisions. If intuition becomes excessive, sensation demands grounding through fatigue, collapse, or physical symptoms. The psyche compensates with ruthless precision. In the world of 2025, this complexity intensifies. The digital age amplifies intuition, floods sensation, distorts feeling, and accelerates thinking. Individuals are bombarded with stimuli that do not match their natural orientation. The thinking type is overwhelmed by emotional content. The feeling type is drowned by information that demands logical processing. The sensation type is destabilized by a world of abstraction. The intuitive type is seduced into endless possibility without grounding. Modernity does not harmonize the functions, it fractures them. To understand oneself in this era requires more than introspection. It requires recognizing the architecture of one's psychic machinery. For example, the thinking introvert who forces themselves to become socially active for acceptance risks internal collapse as they override their natural flow of energy. The sensation extrovert who immerses themselves in digital abstraction risks losing their grounding. The intuitive introvert who isolates excessively drifts into fantasy devoid of embodiment. These are not moral failures. They are misalignments between the psyche's natural structure and the demands imposed by the world. This misalignment leads to psychological inflation or psychological starvation. Inflation occurs when one function grows too dominant, overshadowing the others. The thinking type becomes tyrannical. The feeling type becomes melodramatic. The sensation type becomes mechanical. The intuitive type becomes delusional. Starvation occurs when a function is neglected so deeply it cannot support psychic balance. The person becomes hollow in that domain. The unconscious compensates through dreams, projections, compulsions. Dreams, in particular, reveal the neglected function. A thinking dominant person might dream of being overwhelmed by emotion or drowning in water. A sensation dominant person might dream of floating without gravity. An intuitive dominant person might dream of being trapped in small rooms. These symbols are not random. They point to the energy seeking integration. But most people dismiss their dreams because they do not speak the language of consciousness. They do not realize the psyche is sending instructions for repair. The true task of personality development, as Jung saw it, is individuation, the process of integrating all functions into a cohesive self. This does not mean equalizing them, but acknowledging their existence. The dominant function must relinquish its tyranny. The inferior function must be invited into consciousness. The unconscious must be approached, not resisted. Individuation requires the courage to accept internal contradiction. It demands that we expand rather than perfect ourselves. But expansion is frightening. A thinking type fears becoming emotional. Feeling type fears becoming cold. A sensation type fears becoming abstract. An intuitive type fears becoming ordinary. Each fears the loss of identity, yet without stepping into the inferior function, the psyche remains lopsided, vulnerable to collapse. Individuation is therefore not the path of comfort, but the path of confrontation. It asks the person to stretch beyond their natural inclination, to explore what they unconsciously reject, to develop capacities that destabilize their self-image. As this process unfolds, something remarkable becomes visible. The psyche begins to communicate between layers. The unconscious no longer attacks, but collaborates. Dreams become clearer. Emotions become intelligible. Thoughts become flexible. Behavior becomes intentional. The person feels less like a fragmented bundle of impulses and more like a unified being capable of navigating complexity. Yet this unity opens a deeper question, one the psyche cannot avoid. If the structure of personality shapes the flow of energy, and the unconscious compensates for imbalance, then what happens when the forces beneath the psyche intensify beyond the control of orientation and function? What happens when a deeper, more ancient source of symbols and impulses rises from below, carrying not only personal material, but the shared memory of humanity itself? The next descent begins where personality ends, at the threshold of the collective unconscious, where the individual encounters not just themselves, but the timeless forces that move through all human souls. The collective unconscious does not wait to be invited. It rises when the individual psyche reaches the limits of its personal structure. Once personality, with all its functions and orientations, can no longer contain the pressure of instinct, symbol, and history, something older begins to move. It is the deep ocean beneath the thin surface of individuality. Jung understood this realm not as metaphor, but as psychological geology. Beneath the personal unconscious lies a substratum shared by all human beings, a reservoir of ancient images, instincts, and patterns that have shaped human life long before language carved distinctions between self and world. When this deeper layer awakens, the modern ego, proud of its rational clarity and personal autonomy, finds itself dwarfed by forces it cannot command. The collective unconscious does not speak in sentences. It speaks in symbols. It speaks in myths. It speaks in primordial forms that carry emotional weight far beyond anything the conscious mind can generate. These archetypes are not inherited ideas, but inherited potentials. They shape how we interpret experience, how we imagine meaning, how we respond to crisis, love, death, power, vulnerability. They animate our dreams, our fantasies, our moral impulses, and our fears. The mistake of modern psychology is to assume that consciousness can explain itself without reference to this ancient foundation. But Jung revealed that when we ignore the collective layer, we mistake archetypal energies for personal pathology. We feel the weight of myth without recognizing its name. This layer becomes visible during moments of profound transformation or crisis. When the ego weakens, archetypes rush in. They appear in dreams as overwhelming figures, mothers who both nurture and devour, fathers who both protect and judge, shadows who both threaten and reveal. They appear in emotional states that feel larger than life, love that feels fated, anger that feels ancient, fear that feels disproportionate. These experiences do not originate in personal history alone. They rise from the collective unconscious, demanding recognition. The conscious mind, unprepared for their magnitude, often interprets them as instability. But instability is merely the ego's reaction to forces older than itself. The first truth Jung forces us to confront is that no one is an isolated psychological system. We carry ancestral memory within us. The archetypes we inherit shape the very structure of our imagination. When we fall in love, we do not simply respond to a person. We respond to an archetypal image projected onto them. When we fear betrayal, we do not simply fear loss. We fear the ancient abandonment encoded in human history. When we seek meaning, we do not draw only from personal experience. We draw from the mythic patterns that have guided human consciousness for centuries. The misunderstanding that we create our own symbolism collapses here. The symbols create us. We simply awaken to them. The second truth cuts even deeper. Archetypes become dangerous when unconscious. When their energy rises without being recognized, the ego is overwhelmed. An unintegrated mother archetype becomes suffocating attachment or ruthless control. An unintegrated father archetype becomes oppressive authority or brittle perfectionism. An unconscious hero complex becomes reckless pride. An unconscious shadow becomes projection onto others, leading to prejudice, hatred, or moral absolutism. The person believes they are responding rationally, but they are being moved by forces they cannot see. Jung warned that what remains unconscious does not disappear. It acts from below, and its actions become destructive when consciousness refuses to collaborate. The third truth emerges from the tension between ego and archetype. Growth requires a confrontation with these primordial forms. Avoiding them leaves the ego small, brittle, terrified of its own depths. Confronting them expands the psyche. The mother archetype becomes the capacity to nurture oneself. The father archetype becomes inner authority, grounded in integrity rather than fear. The hero archetype becomes courage without arrogance. The shadow becomes honesty rather than hypocrisy. Integration transforms overwhelming forces into sources of strength. But integration demands humility, because the ego must accept that it is not the center of the psyche, but only one part of a vast internal cosmos. In the world of 2025, this confrontation becomes increasingly unavoidable. Modern culture, obsessed with individuality, erases mythic consciousness from public life. We live in a world that no longer believes in symbols, yet remains governed by them unconsciously. Advertising manipulates archetypes without naming them. Politics mobilizes shadow projections without understanding them. Social movements rise and collapse with mythic intensity, driven by hero narratives and enemy images. People feel compelled by forces they cannot articulate, swept into collective emotions that exceed their personal reasoning. The collective unconscious manifests in society when it is denied in the individual. This denial creates widespread psychological confusion. People no longer recognize the mythic dimensions of their emotions. They interpret existential longing as burnout. They interpret symbolic dreams as random neural activity. They interpret spiritual emptiness as lack of productivity. The hunger for meaning becomes misdiagnosed as anxiety. The longing for transformation becomes pathologized as instability. Jung insisted that modern individuals suffer because they have lost connection to the symbolic layer of existence. Without myth, the psyche starves. Without archetype, life loses depth. Without ritual, consciousness loses grounding. The person becomes fragmented not because they lack identity, but because they lack connection to the deeper structures that give identity coherence. The collective unconscious also reveals itself through synchronicities, events that seem meaningfully connected without causal explanation. These experiences challenge the dominance of rationality. They suggest that life is not merely a sequence of random occurrences, but a field of symbolic resonance. A dream predicts an encounter. A thought appears just before someone speaks it. A symbol repeats itself across unrelated contexts. A person feels guided by something beyond the ego. Jung believed these moments indicate that the psyche is aligning with deeper patterns. Synchronicity is not superstition. It is the language of the collective unconscious. It is the psyche and the world speaking in unison. Yet these experiences unsettled the modern mind because they challenge the belief that consciousness is self-sufficient. When synchronicity occurs, the ego realizes it is not the architect of its reality. It is a participant in a larger symbolic process. This humbles the ego. It also terrifies it. Many dismiss these experiences as coincidence to protect their worldview. But repression of meaning deepens inner conflict. The collective unconscious does not vanish when ignored. It intensifies. Archetypes also emerge powerfully in mythology, which Jung saw not as primitive fiction, but as the symbolic map of human development. Myths describe psychological processes long before psychology named them. They portray the hero's descent into the underworld as the ego's confrontation with the unconscious. They portray the battle with the dragon as the battle with one's shadow. They portray death and rebirth as the cycle of psychological transformation. When individuals connect to myth, they recognize themselves in stories older than their culture. They see their suffering reflected in patterns shared across civilizations. This recognition grants orientation. It tells the psyche it is not alone. But in the age of 2025, myths have been replaced by entertainment, ritual replaced by consumption, symbolism replaced by distraction. The collective unconscious becomes increasingly restless when denied access to consciousness. It erupts in unexpected ways, through mass movements fueled by archetypal rage, through identity crises driven by mythic longing, through cultural polarization that mirrors ancient dualities. These eruptions are not social phenomena alone. They are psychic eruptions. Jung warned that when society loses connection to its myths, archetypes turn violent. The personal cost is equally severe. Individuals who deny the symbolic realm experience a sense of existential homelessness. They feel there is something missing but cannot name it. They long for transcendence but cannot locate a path. They feel called to something larger than themselves, but interpret the call as dissatisfaction with their job, their relationships, their lifestyle. They search outward for what must be discovered inward. Their suffering becomes directionless. They sense the presence of meaning, but fail to decipher its symbols. To begin engaging with the collective unconscious, the ego must adopt a new attitude. It must acknowledge its limitations. It must cultivate symbolic awareness. It must allow meaning to emerge without forcing it into rational categories. This requires stillness, inward listening, attention to dreams, openness to intuition, and humility before the unknown. It requires recognizing that the psyche communicates not through declarations, but through images. It requires accepting that transformation cannot be controlled by will, but must be collaborated with. As the ego enters dialogue with archetypes, a profound shift occurs. The psyche gains depth. Suffering becomes meaningful rather than senseless. Fear becomes guidance rather than paralysis. Desire becomes insight rather than compulsion. The individual begins to feel accompanied by forces larger than themselves. They begin to understand that their inner world is not a closed system, but part of a vast network of human experience shared across cultures and centuries. And yet, confronting the collective unconscious opens the door to an even more unsettling reality. For once the individual recognizes that they are shaped by forces beyond their personal history, they must then face the question of opposition. Within the archetypal landscape lies not only the nurturing mother, the guiding father, the heroic self, but also the ancient adversary, the shadow of the collective, the reservoir of everything humanity has rejected, feared, or destroyed. And when this collective shadow rises, it demands a confrontation far more formidable than anything the personal psyche can manage alone. The collective shadow does not announce itself with thunder. It arrives quietly, like a subtle distortion beneath thoughts and impulses, until suddenly the individual realizes they are no longer confronting only their personal darkness, but the darkness of humanity itself. This is the moment when the descent into the psyche becomes dangerous. The personal shadow can humiliate, sabotage, embarrass, but the collective shadow can consume. Jung understood this with a clarity no modern thinker has surpassed. He insisted that evil is not simply a moral category, but a psychological force, one that grows stronger each time the individual refuses to see it. And when the collective shadow rises, it does not merely reveal our flaws. It reveals what human nature is capable of when stripped of illusion. The world prefers to believe that evil exists somewhere outside the self, in aberrant individuals or corrupt systems. But this belief is a defense, a way of protecting the ego from recognizing its kinship with darkness. Jung argued that evil emerges whenever consciousness disowns part of its own nature. What is ignored becomes autonomous. What is repressed becomes poisonous. What is denied becomes projected outward onto those we choose to call enemy or inferior or monstrous. This projection is the mechanism through which the collective shadow grows. Every society creates demons in others because it refuses to face the demon within. The more virtuous a culture claims to be, the more violently its shadow manifests. The first truth we must confront is that the collective shadow contains everything humanity has rejected about itself: brutality, cruelty, domination, envy, deception, greed, cowardice, vengeance. These forces do not vanish because civilization condemns them. They sink into the unconscious where they wait, and when conditions allow, they rise with catastrophic force. Wars ignite not because a few individuals are evil, but because thousands project their shadow onto opposing groups. Mob violence erupts not because individuals lose control, but because archetypal forces take control. The collective shadow speaks through the crowd with a voice older than reason. The ego recoils from this truth because it wants to believe it is inherently good. But Jung demands something harsher: maturity. The mature psyche acknowledges that goodness requires conscious effort, and that evil grows where awareness refuses to look. The collective shadow becomes destructive when societies insist on their righteousness, when individuals cling to moral superiority, when cultures suppress their guilt. The more virtuous the mask, the darker the shadow behind it. Human beings commit their worst acts not when they feel wicked, but when they feel justified. The second truth strikes even deeper. The collective shadow reveals not only the darkness of groups, but the hidden origins of personal suffering. Many of our fears are not personal at all. They are inherited. The fear of abandonment, the fear of betrayal, the fear of insignificance, the fear of violence, the fear of the unknown, these echo through the centuries. They shaped the psyches of our ancestors and seeped into the structure of the unconscious. The individual feels them as private torment, yet they belong to humanity as a whole. When we confront our personal shadow, we confront inherited wounds. When we confront the collective shadow, we confront ancestral trauma. This realization destabilizes identity. The ego asks, what is truly my own? And the unsettling answer is that much of what we experience comes from a reservoir we did not create. The individual becomes a carrier of collective history shaped by forces they never chose. This truth does not excuse our actions, but it explains the intensity of inner conflict. We are not merely battling our own impulses. We are battling the unresolved impulses of countless generations. Jung saw this clearly in patients whose suffering exceeded their personal biography. Symptoms that could not be traced to early life trauma often trace back to archetypal patterns. The psyche carries the weight of what humanity has refused to face. The third truth emerges as the ego begins to weaken under this revelation. Encountering the collective shadow risks inflation. Inflation occurs when the ego identifies with archetypal forces. The person begins to feel larger than life, persecuted or chosen, superior or damned. Their emotions swell beyond personal proportion. They lose the boundary between individual self and mythic force. This is the psychology of tyranny and fanaticism. The inflated individual believes they act on behalf of destiny, truth, justice, or divine will. They justify cruelty because they feel possessed by something greater than themselves. Inflation is the most dangerous consequence of shadow avoidance because it turns unconscious darkness into conscious righteousness. In the age of 2025, inflation spreads through society like a contagion. Social media amplifies moral certainty. Political tribes project their shadow onto one another with ritualistic fervor. Every group believes itself to be the victim of unprecedented injustice. Every individual feels entitled to anger because anger feels like purpose. The collective shadow finds expression through outrage culture, conspiracy movements, dehumanizing rhetoric, and polarized identities. People no longer see individuals, they see archetypes. They no longer debate ideas, they battle projections. The shadow becomes the architect of the world, shaping events while the ego insists on its innocence. Psychologically, this dynamic becomes catastrophic for the individual. The more a person projects their shadow onto others, the less they understand themselves. They become hollow, reactive, defensive. Their emotional life becomes dominated by fear and hostility. They form relationships not through intimacy, but through shared enemies. They seek validation not through self-knowledge, but through collective anger. The shadow becomes the center of gravity around which their identity spins. And the further they drift from introspection, the more vulnerable they become to being possessed by forces they cannot name. Jung insisted that the only antidote to shadow possession is integration. Integration does not mean accepting evil as permissible. It means acknowledging that the capacity for evil exists within us. It means recognizing our potential for cruelty, for self-deception, for envy, for domination. When we acknowledge these impulses consciously, they lose their ability to manipulate us unconsciously. The integrated person does not become pure, they become honest. And honesty is the first barrier against shadow inflation. To integrate the collective shadow, the individual must adopt an uncomfortable attitude. They must look inward before blaming outward. They must ask what part of themselves contributes to the hostility they perceive in the world. They must recognize that the enemy outside often reflects the enemy within. They must confront their resentment, their prejudice, their hunger for superiority. Projection dissolves only when the inner source is seen. This work is not for the timid, because it demands moral courage, the willingness to admit one's own darkness with the same precision used to judge others. But integration alone is not enough. The shadow contains enormous energy. Once acknowledged, this energy must be transformed. The drive for dominance can become the drive for mastery. The instinct for aggression can become the instinct for protection. The hunger for power can become the hunger for purpose. The impulse toward destruction can become the impulse toward creation. Jung believed that the shadow is not merely the seat of evil, but the wellspring of potential. Our vitality, creativity, passion, and authenticity emerge from the same roots as our darkness. To cut away the shadow entirely would be to amputate the strongest parts of the self. The individual who integrates their shadow becomes grounded. They cease projecting blame. They cease being controlled by unconscious fear. They become capable of genuine empathy because they recognize the darkness in others as a mirror of their own. They become capable of courage because they no longer fear the unknown within themselves. They become capable of moral action because they make decisions from awareness rather than avoidance. They become whole not by purifying themselves, but by acknowledging their complexity. Yet even this achievement opens the door to a deeper confrontation. Shadow integration prepares the individual for the next stage of inner work, facing the inner adversary that is not rooted in collective history alone, but rooted in the personal unconscious. This adversary is the inner critic, the internal tyrant, the voice that punishes, belittles, and judges. It rises not from archetypal shadow, but from internalized authority. And while the collective shadow threatens inflation, the inner adversary threatens implosion. It demands obedience, perfection, submission. Its tyranny is quiet but relentless. And once the shadow is integrated, the ego must face this second, more intimate source of suffering, the force that constricts the soul long after external enemies have been defeated. The inner adversary does not shout, it whispers. Its power lies not in volume, but in intimacy. It speaks in the voice we trust most, our own. After the confrontation with the collective shadow, after the recognition that humanity's darkness lives within us, the psyche reveals a more personal tyrant. This inner critic is the internal authority inherited from parents, culture, religion, and early life. It is the watcher, the judge, the enforcer of impossible standards. It holds the ego hostage, not through violence, but through guilt, shame, and fear of inadequacy. Jung understood that this adversary is not the shadow, though it disguises itself through one. The shadow carries what we reject. The inner critic carries what was imposed upon us before we had the strength to resist. This critic forms early, shaped by the demands of caregivers who could not tolerate our vulnerability, our spontaneity, our anger, our desires. It forms from rules we internalize before understanding their purpose. To survive, the child obeys. To obey, the child suppresses parts of themselves. And when these suppressive forces become internalized, they endure long after the external authority disappears. The inner critic is the ghost of past expectations, living inside the psyche as though they still hold power. It watches every emotion. It judges every decision. It interrogates every impulse. It punishes every imperfection. And because it uses the voice of the self, the ego cannot easily distinguish between inner tyranny and inner responsibility. The first truth we must confront is that the inner critic does not protect us from failure. It protects us from authenticity. Its primary function is not moral guidance, but self-preservation through suppression. It demands that we remain acceptable, controllable, safe. It punishes desires that threaten belonging. It condemns emotions that reveal vulnerability. It mocks ambition that risks rejection. It attacks creativity that might expose inner truth. And while it claims to act in our best interest, its real motive is fear. Fear of losing love, fear of losing approval, fear of losing stability. The misunderstanding that the inner critic keeps us disciplined collapses under this recognition. Its true loyalty is not to growth, but to survival at the smallest possible scale. The second, truth cuts deeper. The inner critic gains power from the ego's insecurity. When the ego doubts itself, the critic grows louder. It becomes a substitute for authority when the ego feels weak. It becomes a blueprint for identity when the ego feels lost. It becomes a source of direction when the ego feels uncertain. But these gifts are poisoned. The critic gives direction without freedom, identity without authenticity, safety without vitality. Its influence transforms the person into a self-censoring being who polices their inner world more harshly than any external tyrant ever could. The critic becomes the primary architect of self-limitation. This architecture reveals itself in daily patterns. The individual wants to rest, but the critic calls them lazy. They want to speak honestly, but the critic warns them of rejection. They want to pursue passion, but the critic labels it unrealistic. They want to express anger, but the critic shames them into silence. The person lives a fraction of their life because the critic slices away anything it deems dangerous. And each time the person obeys, the critic grows stronger. Each time the person resists, the critic grows crueler. This dynamic forms the blueprint of internal oppression. The third truth emerges when we examine the psychological cost of obedience. The inner critic does not merely constrain behavior, it distorts the psyche. It forces the ego to split into two selves, the self that acts and the self that monitors. This division fragments inner life. The person becomes hyper aware of their flaws, their weaknesses, their failures. They magnify their mistakes. They minimize their strengths. They distrust their intuition. They become estranged from their emotional landscape. Their inner world becomes a courtroom where they are always on trial. The critic is prosecutor, judge, and executioner. And the ego, exhausted by this constant scrutiny, becomes small. In the world of 2025, this internal tyranny deepens because society reinforces it. The culture demands perfection, optimization, self-improvement. Social comparison magnifies perceived inadequacy. Digital life amplifies judgment. People curate themselves online, creating fragmented mirrors of identity. The critic feeds on these mirrors. It uses them as evidence that the self is never enough. It demands that the person mold themselves into an image acceptable to others, even if that image contradicts their inner truth. The more the world displays impossible standards, the more the critic tightens its grip. Yet, the inner critic is not purely a product of culture. It is archetypal. It mirrors the punitive father, the stern authority, the divine judge. It embodies the collective fear that freedom will lead to chaos. It is the psychic guardian of conformity. It maintains order by demanding repression. Jung saw this adversary as a necessary but dangerous figure. Without structure, the psyche collapses into instinct. But without freedom, the psyche collapses into rigidity. The inner critic becomes destructive when it ceases to serve balance and becomes the ruler of the soul. To confront this adversary, the individual must first separate its voice from their own. This is difficult because the critic imitates the tone of inner thought. But subtle differences reveal its presence. The critic speaks in absolutes. You always fail. You never change. The critic speaks from fear. If you try, you will lose everything. The critic speaks without nuance. You should not feel this. You should not want that. The critic speaks with cruelty, never compassion. Once the ego recognizes these signals, the spell breaks. The critic is revealed as an internalized figure, not an intrinsic truth. Awareness weakens its power, but recognition is only the beginning. The next step is rebellion. The person must disobey the critic. They must act in ways the critic forbids. They must rest when the critic demands productivity. They must speak when the critic insists on silence. They must pursue desire when the critic insists on safety. Each act of defiance weakens the critic and strengthens the self. This rebellion is not impulsive, it is existential. It is the reclamation of agency from an internal tyrant. However, rebellion alone is insufficient because the critic is not only punitive, it is protective. It formed to shield the child from danger. Its methods grew cruel, but its origin was fear. To truly disarm the critic, the individual must understand its wound. The critic fears the very things the ego longs for: visibility, vulnerability, ambition, authenticity. It fears these because it learned that these qualities invited punishment in the past. The critic is trapped in time. It operates from a worldview the adult no longer inhabits. To heal it, one must show it that the world is changed and that suppression is no longer necessary for survival. This healing requires compassion, a concept often misunderstood as softness. But compassion is not gentle, it is precise. It reveals without cruelty. It confronts without violence. It liberates without annihilation. When the individual approaches the critic with compassion, something shifts. The critic loses its rigid posture. It becomes less judge and more frightened guardian. Its voice weakens, not because it is defeated, but because it is understood. The ego no longer accepts its authority, but it does not deny its fear. This balance allows integration. Integration transforms the critic into conscience. Conscience is not punitive. It guides without dominating. It evaluates without destroying. It offers correction without contempt. Conscience is aligned with the adult self, not the frightened child. It collaborates instead of commanding. It becomes a source of inner authority grounded in truth rather than fear. Jung believed that a mature psyche carries its own law, not imposed from outside, but arising from integration. When the critic evolves into conscience, the individual gains this inner law. At this stage, the psyche reaches a new equilibrium. The shadow has been acknowledged. The critic has been confronted. The ego has regained autonomy. Yet this victory reveals another horizon. Once the internal tyrant loses power, another aspect of the psyche steps forward, one older, more instinctual, and far less willing to compromise. This instinctual force does not whisper like the critic or distort like the shadow. It pulses. It demands. It carries the raw energy of life itself, unshaped by culture, logic, or morality. And when it rises, the ego faces a new challenge, the confrontation with the instinctual self, the wild and ancient core that civilization has tried and failed to tame. Instinct rises like a force that remembers a world older than thought. It does not negotiate. It does not apologize. It does not bend to the demands of politeness or moral structure. When the inner critic weakens and the shadow has been confronted, instinct steps forward as the raw pulse of the psyche. It is life before language, desire before interpretation, movement before meaning. Civilization has tried to bury it beneath routines, laws, and rationality. Yet instinct survives in the marrow, untouched by centuries of refinement. Jung knew this layer well. He saw that instinct is not chaos, but a fundamental intelligence the ego has learned to fear because it cannot fully control it. The first truth that emerges is that instinct is not primitive in the way modern consciousness believes. It is precise. It knows what the body needs, what the psyche lacks, what the soul hungers for. It guides us toward danger when growth requires rupture. It guides us toward rest when exhaustion becomes denial. It guides us toward desire when repression becomes self-betrayal. Instinct does not ask permission. It demands alignment. The misunderstanding that instinct is animalistic collapses here. Instinct is the ancient guardian of vitality, and when instinct is ignored, vitality drains quietly until the self feels hollow. This hollowness is everywhere in the age of 2025. People live in their minds, disconnected from their bodies, detached from impulses that could anchor them. They outsource intuition to algorithms, outsource rhythm to schedules, outsource decision to social validation. The instinctual core becomes dormant, not dead, but dormant, and its silence becomes suffering. The person feels ungrounded, anxious without cause, restless without direction. They long for something but cannot name it. That longing is instinct calling from beneath the surface, asking to be reclaimed. The second truth is that instinct only becomes dangerous when repressed. When allowed expression, it is creative. When denied, it becomes destructive. Suppressed desire becomes compulsion. Suppressed aggression becomes self-harm. Suppressed longing becomes obsession. Suppressed vitality becomes despair. Instinct does not vanish, ignored, it mutates. The ego believes repression is control, but repression is gasoline poured onto a slow-burning fire. Instinct grows stronger in darkness. It waits for moments of weakness. It breaks through in impulses that shock the individual who believes themselves rational and composed. The eruption is not madness. It is instinct reclaiming its rightful territory. This eruption reveals another truth. Instinct protects the psyche from psychological starvation. When the ego becomes too rigid, too obedient, too self-controlled, instinct intervenes. It disrupts routines. It interrupts relationships. It sabotages goals that betray the deeper self. It forces the individual into situations they consciously resist, but unconsciously need. Jung believed instinct is the biological root of the unconscious. It is the foundation upon which symbols, dreams, and archetypes are built. Without it, the psyche collapses into abstraction. The individual becomes a machine mimicking humanity. Yet, instinct alone is not enough. If the ego surrenders completely, the person becomes impulsive, reactive, directionless. They follow urges without reflection, confusing instinct with entitlement. This is the other extreme, identification with instinct. When the ego inflates and claims instinct as justification for its desires, the psyche loses balance. Instinct becomes weapon rather than guide. The person rationalizes harm by calling it authenticity. They confuse emotional chaos with freedom. They mistake rebellion for individuality. True instinct does not demand destruction. It demands alignment with the deeper truth of the self. The task is therefore not repression or surrender, but integration. This requires listening to instinct without being ruled by it, feeling the pulse without drowning in it, honoring desire without confusing it with destiny. The integrated individual learns to interpret instinct as information. Anger becomes boundary. Fear becomes intuition. Desire becomes direction. Resistance becomes signal. The body becomes a compass rather than an adversary. The psyche becomes coherent because its foundational energy is neither suppressed nor unleashed blindly. But integration demands a confrontation with the ego's illusions. The ego wants control. Instinct refuses to be controlled. The ego wants certainty. Instinct offers only movement. The ego wants approval. Instinct cares nothing for approval. This conflict terrifies the ego because instinct reveals how much of life lies outside conscious command. To integrate instinct is to accept limitation. It is to admit that the deepest truths of the self are not created by thought, but discovered through embodiment. Many resist this realization because it exposes how fragile the ego's authority truly is. Yet when instinct returns, something awakens. Creativity sharpens. Desire clarifies. Intuition strengthens. The person moves with conviction rather than hesitation. They feel present rather than fragmented. Instinct anchors them in the world, reminding them that life is not lived in concepts, but in breath, sensation, hunger, rhythm. They rediscover what it means to exist as a unified being, not a disembodied mind dragging a reluctant body behind it. Still, instinct brings us to the threshold of another layer of psychological reality. For once instinct is acknowledged and its force no longer feared, the psyche begins to shift again. Something subtler rises. Not as primal as instinct, not as punitive as the critic, not as dark as the shadow. Something symbolic, something visionary, something that does not pulse but illuminates. An inner figure, neither human nor animal, begins to form in dreams, imagination, and intuition. A figure that guides rather than judges. A figure that holds wisdom the ego cannot produce. The force the ancient world called the inner guide, the spiritual center, the image of wholeness. And when this figure emerges, the psyche prepares for its most transformative encounter. The inner guide does not arrive with thunder or revelation. It emerges slowly, like a figure stepping out from behind a veil the psyche has carried for years. It appears only when the individual has faced shadow, silenced the critic, and reclaimed instinct. For only then does the psyche possess enough strength to receive a presence that does not command but invites, does not demand but reveals. Jung understood this figure as the deeper center of the psyche, the archetype of meaning, the symbol of psychological direction. It is not the ego. It is not a fantasy. It is the expression of the self, the organizing principle that holds all fragments of the psyche in potential unity. The first truth to confront is that the inner guide is not gentle. Its guidance cuts. It strips excuses. It exposes contradictions. It confronts illusions with a clarity the ego finds unbearable. Yet this clarity does not shame. It awakens. The guide speaks in dreams, in sudden intuition, in moments of quiet recognition, when the soul knows without explanation. It directs the individual not toward comfort, but toward necessity. It leads them into situations that demand maturity. It dismantles the ego's defenses not to destroy them, but to reveal the deeper structure beneath. The misunderstanding that guidance feels pleasant collapses here. True guidance disrupts before it harmonizes. This guide takes many forms in the psyche. In men, it often appears as the anima, the inner feminine carrying emotion, creativity, and connection. In women, it appears as the animus, the inner masculine carrying clarity, direction, and authority. These are not gendered stereotypes, but symbolic energies. They compensate for what consciousness lacks. When the inner guide rises, it brings the traits the ego has neglected. The thinker becomes capable of feeling. The idealist becomes capable of grounding. The restrained become capable of passion. The scattered become capable of direction. The guide completes what consciousness alone cannot build. The second truth is that the guide requires sacrifice. Not sacrifice of morality or belonging, but sacrifice of the ego's illusions about itself. The ego must relinquish its claim to centrality. It must accept that meaning does not arise from will, but from alignment with deeper structures. It must surrender its fantasies of control. The guide speaks only when the individual is willing to listen without twisting its message to suit their preferences. This is why many ignore it. They want guidance that supports their desires, not guidance that reveals their blind spots. The inner guide demands honesty, and honesty is the rarest courage. This honesty appears first in the form of discomfort. The guide reveals truths the ego has avoided, that a relationship has died, that a career betrays the soul, that an ambition masks fear, that a belief has become prison. It offers direction through recognition rather than instruction. It does not tell the person what to do. It shows them who they are becoming. And this vision, once seen, cannot be unseen. The tension between the ego and the emerging self becomes the engine of transformation. The individual feels pulled forward by something they did not choose, yet cannot deny. In the age of 2025, this inner guidance becomes more essential than ever. The external world offers endless distraction, endless noise, endless artificial meaning. Algorithms predict desire before the individual feels it. Culture floods the psyche with images that drown intuition. In such an environment, the inner guide becomes the last remaining compass that cannot be manipulated. Its voice is quiet, not because it is weak, but because truth does not compete for attention. It waits for stillness. It waits for the psyche to turn inward. It waits for the moment when the individual admits that external direction has failed them. The third truth is that the guide does not guarantee safety, it guarantees authenticity. When the guide awakens, the individual often enters a period of confusion. Old desires fade. Old identities crumble. Old routines feel hollow. The ego searches for stability, but stability no longer exists in familiar forms. The guide leads not backward, but inward. It directs the person toward choices that align with their deeper structure, even if these choices demand uncertainty or solitude. Jung insisted that the guide never leads into destruction. It leads into confrontation with what must be faced for the self to unfold. Yet the guide offers something the ego cannot generate: meaning. Meaning is not pleasure. It is not comfort. It is the feeling that one's life fits into a pattern larger than personal desire. It is the sense that suffering is not random, that purpose is not illusion, that the inner world and the outer world can resonate. When the guide begins to shape consciousness, this meaning becomes palpable. It appears in synchronicities, in symbolic dreams, in moments of uncanny clarity, when events align as though orchestrated. These moments are not magic. They are signs that the psyche is no longer divided against itself. But the emergence of the guide creates a new tension. Once direction is sensed, the ego becomes tempted to seize it, to force transformation, to accelerate development. This impatience is dangerous. Transformation cannot be rushed because the unconscious unfolds at its own pace. The guide does not push, it regulates, it adjusts, it offers glimpses rather than blueprints. The individual must learn a rhythm of inner life, which is slower, deeper, and more deliberate than the ego desires. Impatience leads to inflation. Inflation distorts the message. The individual begins to believe they have achieved enlightenment when they have merely glimpsed possibility. The guide must be followed, not claimed. Eventually, as the guide stabilizes within consciousness, psychological life gains coherence. Individual no longer moves through the world as a bundle of instincts, projections, fears, and inherited expectations. They move with intention. They move with presence. They move with an inner axis that cannot be broken by external chaos. But this coherence does not mark the end of development. It marks the beginning of integration on a deeper plane. For the guide, once awakened, does not exist for its own sake. Its true purpose is to lead the psyche toward a state beyond conflict, beyond fragmentation, beyond the old divisions between conscious and unconscious. It leads toward the possibility of wholeness, a possibility symbolized by an archetype older and more encompassing than any inner figure encountered thus far. And when this archetype begins to stir, the entire psyche shifts orientation, as though preparing for a culmination it has sensed but never articulated. A center begins to glow beneath all layers of the self, drawing the fragmented parts into orbit. The guide steps back. The ego grows silent. The unconscious gathers. And the deeper self, the totality of the psyche, begins to emerge from the shadows. Wholeness does not arrive gently. It begins as a pressure from within, a gravitational pull, drawing every part of the psyche toward a center the ego has never fully recognized. After the guide emerges, after instinct returns, after the critic is confronted and the shadow is integrated, something deeper begins to stir. It is not a figure. It is not a voice. It is a presence. The self in Jung's sense is not the ego. It is the totality of the psyche, the union of conscious and unconscious, the full architecture of what a human being can become. When this center awakens, the individual feels both expansion and collapse. Expansion because life suddenly feels larger than personal desire. Collapse because the ego senses its final dethronement. The first truth the emergence of the self reveals is that identity has always been provisional. The ego believes. It defines the self. It believes it stands at the center. But the self exposes the ego as only one fragment of a far larger system. The ego organizes daily life. The self organizes meaning. The ego seeks stability. The self seeks integration. The ego fears contradiction. The self requires it. When the self rises, the boundaries the ego used to defend itself begin to soften. It becomes harder to cling to one-sided beliefs, harder to maintain rigid identities, harder to pretend that the conscious mind alone governs the psyche. The misunderstanding that we are who we think we are dissolves here. The self unveils the broader truth. We are the sum of everything consciousness has refused to acknowledge. The second truth is that the self does not seek perfection, but balance. It calls every neglected part of the psyche into visibility. If the ego leans too heavily on logic, the self amplifies feeling. If the ego clings to independence, the self awakens longing. If the ego demands purity, self reveals shadow. If the ego rejects instinct, the self intensifies desire. This is not sabotage. It is regulation. The self restores equilibrium by drawing the psyche toward its center, not through force, but through symbolic pressure. Dreams intensify. Synchronicities multiply. Emotional themes repeat with uncanny precision. Life begins to mirror the inner world. The person feels guided not by the ego's will, but by a deeper intelligence that orchestrates psychological development. This orchestration becomes unmistakable during periods of crisis. When the ego resists growth, the self applies pressure. Relationships crumble. Old patterns fail. Illusions collapse. The person feels pushed into transformation by forces beyond their control. Jung understood that these crises are not punishments, but initiations. The self dismantles structures that no longer serve integration. It strips away false identities. It exposes the fractures the ego tried to ignore. And in this exposure, possibility of renewal emerges. But renewal requires surrender. A surrender not to fate, but to the inner principle guiding the psyche toward wholeness. In the world of 2025, this process becomes even more crucial. The external environment overwhelms the ego with stimuli, responsibilities, and conflicting demands. Many people experience breakdown, not because they are weak, but because the psyche is overwhelmed by an outer world that refuses to slow down. The self intervenes when the ego cannot maintain coherence. It interrupts the compulsive pursuit of productivity. It disrupts identities built on performance. It demands introspection in a culture terrified of silence. Breakdown becomes breakthrough when the individual recognizes the deeper intelligence beneath the collapse. The third truth is that the emergence of the self brings with it a moral dimension. Not morality imposed from outside, but morality arising from within. The self aligns the individual with their genuine values rather than inherited rules. It reveals what matters, not through obligation, but through resonance. Certain actions feel false. Certain relationships feel misaligned. Certain ambitions feel hollow. The person begins to sense the direction of their life not through external validation, but through internal coherence. This is the morality of the integrated psyche, a commitment to truth as it reveals itself through the unfolding of the self. This commitment often leads to solitude. The ego seeks belonging through conformity. The self seeks authenticity through differentiation. When the self awakens, the individual may feel detached from old social circles, old beliefs, old roles. Others may call this withdrawal. It is not withdrawal, it is individuation. The person is shedding identities that no longer reflect their inner reality. They are creating space for a more authentic existence to emerge. Solitude becomes a forge where the psyche reorganizes itself around its true center. But with this solitude comes a deeper vulnerability. The self demands honesty, and honesty dismantles illusion. The individual must face the full truth of their life without anesthetic. They must confront the ways they have betrayed themselves, the times they have lived smaller than their potential, the compromises that have distorted their path. This confrontation is painful, but it is also liberating. For once the truth is acknowledged, the psyche gains the freedom to move toward wholeness without resistance. As wholeness grows, the individual encounters a paradox. The more they integrate, the more they feel connected to something larger than themselves. This is not abstraction. It is a concrete psychological experience. The boundaries between inner world and outer world begin to blur. Events feel meaningful. Encounters feel fated. The person senses an invisible thread weaving through their life. Jung called this the reality of the self, a reality that transcends personal will. The ego, once terrified of losing control, begins to trust the process. It becomes a participant rather than a ruler. Yet the self's emergence does not resolve all conflict. It intensifies a question that has been present from the beginning. How can a human being live in alignment with the totality of their psyche while still navigating the demands of the external world? To follow the self requires strength, discernment, courage. It requires confronting the chaos of the unconscious without dissolving into it. It requires maintaining the ego without allowing it to dominate. This balance is not a final state. It is a lifelong dialogue between parts of the psyche that seek integration. And this dialogue leads naturally to the next confrontation. For once the self awakens, the psyche faces its final task, the union of opposites, the reconciliation of conscious and unconscious, the symbolic death and rebirth that completes individuation. This is not metaphor. It is psychological reality. The self prepares the individual for a transformation that will strip away the last illusions, the last attachments, the last remnants of fragmentation. And when this final process begins, the psyche enters the deepest territory of all, the realm where the old self dissolves to make room for the one who has been waiting beneath it from the beginning. Transformation does not begin with triumph. It begins with dissolution. When the self awakens and pulls every fragment of the psyche toward its center, the ego feels the ground shift beneath it. The structures that once brought stability begin to tremble. Beliefs that once felt like truth dissolve into symbols. Identity, once defended with ferocity, begins to feel provisional. The psyche approaches the threshold where the union of opposites becomes inevitable. This is the moment Jung recognized as the symbolic death, the psychological crucifixion of the ego before it can be reborn into a deeper form of being. It is not metaphor. It is the inward experience of collapse that precedes renewal. The first truth to confront is that the ego cannot survive this process in its previous form. Its defenses must fall. Its illusions must crack. Its certainty must surrender. The ego has spent years, sometimes decades, protecting itself from the unconscious. But now the unconscious no longer arrives as shadow or instinct or ancestral weight. It arrives as the totality of what the psyche is meant to become. The ego cannot resist such a force without breaking, so it breaks. The individual feels confusion, disorientation, sometimes despair. They no longer know who they are. They no longer know what they want. They no longer trust the structures that once defined them. This collapse is necessary. Without the death of the outdated ego, the new center cannot emerge. The second truth is that the union of opposites requires embracing contradictions that the ego once rejected. The conscious and the unconscious are not meant to be enemies. They are meant to be partners. The rational mind must join with instinct. Feeling must join with thought. Vulnerability must join with strength. Light must join with shadow. These unions do not create harmony immediately. They create tension that feels unbearable because the psyche is learning a new language. The individual must contain what once felt incompatible. They must endure the paradox without retreating into simplicity. Jung insisted that the capacity to hold opposites without collapsing is the highest psychological achievement. It is the beginning of wholeness. This stage often manifests in symbols. Dreams depict death, burial, descent, dismemberment. These images mirror the internal dissolution of the old ego. But dreams also reveal the seeds of rebirth, a new child, a rising sun, a door opening into unknown light. These symbols do not comfort, they direct. They show that the psyche is reorganizing itself at the deepest level. But the ego, still wounded from collapse, may resist this symbolic process. It may cling to old identities, old attachments, old certainties. This resistance prolongs suffering. The way through is surrender, not passivity, but trust in the self's deeper intelligence. In the world of 2025, surrender is almost impossible. Modern culture worships control. People are taught to curate their identity, manage their emotions, optimize their lives. But the individuation process destroys this illusion of control. It forces the person to confront the reality that psychological life cannot be engineered. Meaning cannot be manufactured. Wholeness cannot be scheduled. The individual must relinquish the fantasy that they can shape themselves without engaging the depths. This surrender is a confrontation with cultural conditioning as much as with the psyche itself. The third truth is that the rebirth of the ego is not the return of the old self improved. It is the emergence of a self aligned with the totality of the psyche. The new ego is humble because it has tasted dissolution. It is flexible because it has held contradiction. It is honest because it has faced shadow. It is brave because it has endured collapse. It becomes the servant of the self rather than its rival. And in this new relationship, the psyche gains coherence. The inner world becomes less chaotic. The unconscious becomes less threatening. The individual begins to sense inner guidance, not as an intruder, but as an ally. This rebirth changes everything. Desire becomes clearer because it arises not from compensation, but from alignment. Relationships shift because the individual no longer seeks validation from others to protect an insecure ego. Creativity deepens because instinct and imagination begin to cooperate. Morality strengthens because conscience becomes rooted in authenticity rather than fear. The world feels different because the individual moves through it with a center that cannot be destabilized by external turbulence. Yet, even in this state of renewal, the transformation is not complete. The psyche has integrated opposites, but it has not yet embodied them. The self has revealed its presence, but it has not yet lived fully through the individual. The ego has been reborn, but it has not yet learned to act from its new foundation. There remains one final movement, one final ascent. Rebirth must become embodiment. Integration must become action. Symbolic union must become lived experience. And this requires the final task Jung named: the return to the world with consciousness transformed. But before the psyche can return to the world, it must first stabilize the new center. It must learn to move with the rhythm of the self. It must test its strength against ordinary life. It must carry the light it has found into places where old habits still linger. This is where the deepest challenge begins. It is one thing to awaken, it is another to live awake. The ego must now learn how to exist as a conscious partner of the self, neither collapsing into old patterns nor inflating into spiritual certainty. It must learn balance, not as a concept, but as a way of being. And as this learning begins, another door opens. Beyond rebirth lies embodiment. Beyond the transformation of the psyche lies the transformation of life. Beyond inner awakening lies the question that has waited since the beginning. How does a human being live once they have become whole? The answer does not come through thoughts, but through the next movement of the journey, where the inner work must unfold in the outer world. To understand oneself is never a journey toward perfection. It is a journey toward truth. And the truth of a human being has never been a straight line. We are consciousness and unconsciousness, light and shadow, instinct and symbol, fragments that keep calling each other back toward a center we rarely touch. Jung revealed that a person is not a problem to fix, but a mystery to confront. And that mystery opens only when we are willing to face the darkness we have avoided for years. In the noise of 2025, when the outer world screams louder than the inner world, the return to the psyche is no longer optional. It is survival. We must understand why we suffer, why we repeat the same patterns, why invisible forces shape our choices. We must see how complexes fight for dominance inside us, how the shadow demands recognition, how instinct demands release, how anima and animus demand dialogue, and how the self stands at the center, calling us to grow, to share delusion, to become whole. As we move through this inner landscape, we discover a truth both humbling and liberating. No one walks this path alone. What we feel, humanity has felt. What we fear, our ancestors feared. The symbols that rise in our dreams have risen for centuries. We belong to a psychological lineage older than memory. And because of this, even the darkest moments of the journey are not without direction. In collapse, there is the seed of transformation. In conflict, the push toward integration. In suffering, the invitation to meaning. When we understand ourselves more deeply, the world itself becomes less hostile, not because it changes, but because we finally meet it with a psyche that is no longer at war with itself.